What would you do if love could topple a kingdom? If faith could burn a nation? If a single crown could decide the fate of centuries? This is the story of the Tudors, England's most dramatic dynasty. Born on a battlefield drenched in blood, they ruled with ambition, fire, and fear. From Henry VIII, the king who defied the Pope and married 6 wives, to Elizabeth I, the queen who faced down an empire and turned England into a rising power, the Tudors were never ordinary monarchs. They were warriors, tyrants, reformers, and icons. Behind their crowns lay betrayal and devotion, faith and fire, love and loss. Their century was short, but it changed England forever. And though the dynasty ended with Elizabeth's final breath, the legend of the Tudors has never died. Step into a world where passion shapes politics, where religion divides kingdoms, and where a single family forges the destiny of a nation. The rise of Henry VII. The battlefield of Bosworth lay drenched in mist and the iron scent of blood. In August 1485, England's fate hung in the balance as 2 weary armies faced each other. The battered forces of King Richard III, last of the Plantagenets, and the determined host of Henry Tudor, a man whose claim to the throne seemed as fragile as a reed in the wind. Yet it was on this uncertain field that a new dynasty was born, a house that would reshape England for more than a century. Henry Tudor was not expected to become a king. Born in 1457 in Pembroke Castle, he came into the world during the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, the long struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York. His father, Edmund Tudor, died before Henry's birth, leaving him vulnerable. His mother, the young Lady Margaret Beaufort, was only 13 when she gave birth to him. From the beginning, Henry's survival seemed a matter of fortune rather than destiny. Yet fortune, though fickle, sometimes favors the patient. For most of his youth, Henry lived as an exile. Following the Yorkist victory in 1471, he fled across the Channel to Brittany, a fugitive watched but not destroyed, protected yet never secure. To many, he seemed a footnote in the chronicles of dynastic strife. But to his supporters, particularly those disillusioned by Richard III's ruthless seizure of the crown after the mysterious disappearance of his nephews, the princes in the Tower, Henry represented hope. He was the last viable male heir of the Lancastrian line, a flickering candle in the darkness. The stage was set by Richard's own actions. After the death of King Edward IV in 1483, Richard seized the throne from his nephew Edward V, declaring the boy illegitimate. The young king and his brother vanished into the Tower of London, never to be seen again. Whispers of murder stained Richard's reign, and loyalty began to fracture. Nobles who had once sworn to defend the Yorkist line now questioned the crown they served. Out of that growing discontent rose the Tudor cause. When Henry Tudor landed on the coast of Wales in August 1485, he carried more than weapons and soldiers. He carried a vision. His march through the Welsh countryside was a slow gathering of momentum, like a river swelling with each tributary. Local lords, many with Lancastrian sympathies, rallied to his banner. By the time he faced Richard III at Bosworth Field, Henry's small force had grown into a formidable army. Still, he was the underdog, his crown not yet forged, his fate resting on the clash of steel and the turn of loyalty. The battle itself was brief but decisive. Richard fought with courage, leading a desperate cavalry charge to cut down Henry personally. For a moment, the crown of England seemed destined to remain with the Plantagenets, but fate intervened. The Stanley family, powerful nobles who had long wavered between the two sides, chose this moment to throw their weight behind Henry. Their intervention turned the tide. Richard was surrounded and struck down, the last English king to die on the battlefield. The crown, literally torn from Richard's head, was placed upon Henry's brow. In that instant, the Wars of the Roses ended, and the Tudor dynasty began. Henry VII's victory was more than a personal triumph. It was a political settlement. He claimed the throne by right of conquest, but also by descent from the Lancastrian line through his mother. To secure his legitimacy, he arranged a marriage to Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, thus uniting the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York. It was a marriage of reconciliation, designed to heal decades of civil war. Out of bloodshed was born a new symbol, the Tudor rose, a fusion of red and white, the emblem of unity. Henry's ascent marked a turning point in English history. He was cautious, calculating, and deeply aware of the fragility of power. Unlike the reckless lords who had bled England in dynastic struggles, Henry understood that survival required more than battlefield valor. It demanded control of finances, careful diplomacy, and a relentless watch over potential rivals. He began the long work of restoring order to a kingdom weary of chaos, centralizing authority in the crown and laying the groundwork for a dynasty that would dominate the 16th century. The imagery of his rise is striking. A boy born into exile, hardened by years of uncertainty, stepping onto the stage of history at the moment England craved stability. The story of Henry VII is not one of romantic heroism, but of endurance, calculation, and seizing opportunity when the tide of fortune shifted. His crown was not inherited in peace but won in blood, and with it came both the weight of history and the promise of renewal. When the dust settled at Bosworth, the people of England could not yet know that they had witnessed the dawn of an era. Yet in that moment, as Henry was hailed king, the nation entered a new chapter. From the ashes of civil war rose the Tudor dynasty, a house that would give England some of its most notorious and celebrated monarchs, from the imperious Henry VIII to the majestic Elizabeth I. Henry VII's rise was the prologue to a saga of power, faith, and empire. It was the first brushstroke on the canvas of a century that would redefine what it meant to be English, and it began with a crown lifted from the dust of Bosworth Field. Yet Henry's victory at Bosworth, decisive as it was, could not be understood in isolation. For beyond England's shores, the world itself was shifting. Europe stood on the brink of a new age, where monarchies rose, empires expanded, and faith itself trembled on the edge of transformation. The European context, at the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century. When Henry VII placed the battered crown upon his head at Bosworth in 1485, he did not rise into a vacuum. His England stood upon the edge of a continent in transformation. Europe, in those years, was a restless giant stirring from medieval slumber. The old feudal order, fractured and local, was giving way to a new era of central monarchies, bold explorations, and dangerous religious currents. The 16th century was not merely approaching. It was already pressing upon the door, demanding entry with the thunder of cannon and the spread of ink across parchment. Across the Channel, France loomed as the great colossus of the age. Emerging from its own century of turmoil in the 100 Years' War, the French crown had stitched together its realm with steady hands. Under Louis XI and his successors, the monarchy curbed the power of fractious nobles and drew the kingdom into a tighter, more disciplined whole. France had become the most populous kingdom in Europe, its armies formidable, its ambitions stretching toward Italy and beyond. To Henry VII, cautious and deliberate, the power of France was both a threat and a template, a warning of what could crush him, and a model of what he might build in England. To the north, Spain was no longer the fractured land of Moorish emirates and feuding Christian kingdoms. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 had created a new unity, a Spain reborn in blood and faith. In 1492, the last Muslim stronghold of Granada fell, completing the Reconquista and giving the monarchs the aura of crusading champions. Yet that same year, as Granada's banners were lowered, Christopher Columbus sailed westward under Spanish patronage, stumbling upon the New World. Gold, silver, and lands beyond imagining now beckoned across the ocean. Spain was not only united, It was poised to become a global empire. Farther east, the Holy Roman Empire sprawled, immense and unwieldy, more a mosaic than a nation. Its emperor wore a crown of ancient prestige, but wielded power that waxed and waned with the loyalty of German princes. Yet even here, the winds of change stirred. The Habsburg family, patient and calculating, began weaving marriages and alliances into a net of influence that would soon encircle Europe. The empire, though fragmented, was a stage upon which new dramas of religion and power would soon unfold. Italy, by contrast, was a glittering jewel fractured into a dozen shards. The Renaissance had blossomed there, turning Florence, Venice, and Rome into beacons of art, learning, and wealth. But beauty bred envy, and envy bred war. Competing city-states schemed and fought, drawing in the ambitions of France and Spain. Rome itself, seat of the papacy, was both spiritual center and temporal prize, its pontiffs balancing prayer with politics, scripture with the sword. At the heart of this shifting world stood the Pope, heir to St. Peter, whose blessing, or curse, could topple kings. In the late 15th century, the papacy was both revered and reviled, powerful yet vulnerable. Its spiritual authority spanned Christendom, yet its worldly reputation was stained by corruption, indulgence, and intrigue. The Vatican was as much a palace of Renaissance splendor as it was the guardian of faith. From this uneasy foundation, storms would soon erupt that would split the Church itself, but in Henry VII's time, the Pope still sat as arbiter of legitimacy. Beyond the frontiers of Christendom, new forces pressed upon Europe's borders. In the east, the Ottoman Empire advanced under the Crescent Banner, having seized Constantinople in 1453 and transformed it into Istanbul. Their fleets prowled the Mediterranean. Their armies threatened Hungary and the Balkans. To European rulers, the Ottomans were both a terrifying menace and a convenient rallying cry, a reason to unite under banners of crusade, even as they quarreled among themselves. Meanwhile, the very fabric of knowledge was shifting. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century was rippling outward like a stone cast into a pond. Ideas could now spread faster than armies, and no king could wholly control the flow of words once ink touched paper. Humanism, born in the schools of Italy, began to spread across Europe, urging men to look not only to heaven, but also to the dignity and potential of mankind. Books, once precious rarities, multiplied, carrying with them questions that would soon shake the pillars of faith and monarchy alike. For England, perched on the edge of this turbulent continent, the stakes were high. It was a small kingdom compared to the vast power of France or the rising might of Spain. Its strength lay in its insularity, the Channel serving as moat and shield, but also as barrier to influence and trade. To survive, England would need more than military might. It would need cunning diplomacy and careful balance. Henry VII, wary from years of exile, understood this well. His reign would be defined not by reckless conquest, but by patient maneuvering within this European chessboard. Thus, the crown seized at Bosworth was no mere local prize. It was an entry ticket to the greater drama of Europe. England could no longer remain a backwater, consumed by its own civil wars. The 15th century had been the age of feudal bloodshed. The 16th would be the age of nations, of faith tested, of oceans crossed, and of power centralized. The horizon of Europe was alive with fire, the blaze of cannons, the glow of Renaissance art, the sparks of voyages that stretched across oceans. Into this storm, Henry VII guided his fragile throne, seeking not glory but survival, not expansion but endurance. Yet in his caution lay the seed of something greater. The Tudors, heirs of his crown, would not merely endure this new Europe. They would, in time, stand at its very heart. But if Henry VII had secured England's survival in a turbulent Europe, it would be his son, Henry VIII, who transformed survival into spectacle, and whose reign would burn with passion, ambition, and scandal. The man Henry VIII. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, a new dawn seemed to break over England. The nation, weary of Henry VII's careful austerity and shadowed caution, suddenly found itself ruled by a young prince of extraordinary vigor. At 17, Henry was tall, broad-shouldered, and strikingly handsome, his auburn hair shining in the torchlight, his face radiant with the confidence of youth. Chroniclers compared him to the heroes of old, a figure out of legend rather than politics, a king who seemed to embody strength, charm, and divine favor. From the beginning, Henry was more than a monarch. He was a spectacle. He excelled in every pursuit that Renaissance courts admired. He jousted with ferocity, tilted in shining armor before cheering crowds. He hunted with tireless energy, galloping through the forests with hawk and hound. He danced, sang, and played the lute with a grace that astonished ambassadors. His court was alive with pageantry, masks, and tournaments, each carefully staged to display not only the wealth of the crown, but the charisma of the king himself. To his subjects, Henry was not merely ruling, he was dazzling. Yet beneath the splendor was a restless heart. Henry had been raised not to rule, but to serve. As the second son, his early years were shaped by the expectation that his elder brother, Arthur, would wear the crown. Henry was educated for the church, steeped in theology, fluent in Latin, immersed in the works of scholars both ancient and modern. He absorbed the ideals of Renaissance humanism, a lover of learning as well as of sport. But fate shifted suddenly in 1502 when Arthur died, leaving young Henry the heir to his father's fragile dynasty. The scholar prince was thrust into the role of future king, and the careful hand of Henry VII shaped him with suspicion and restraint. The young Henry chafed under his father's rule. Where the elder king was calculating and frugal, the son yearned for brilliance and adventure. When Henry VII died in 1509, the new king seemed to explode into freedom. He swept aside his father's cautious advisers, filling his court with companions of his own choosing. He married Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, in a dazzling ceremony that bound England to Spain and to the great Catholic powers of Europe. For the people, this marriage was not simply political. It was romantic, the union of a chivalric king and a queen of royal blood. Henry saw himself as more than a king of England. He saw himself as a Renaissance monarch, destined to rival the grandeur of France's Francis I or the might of the Habsburg Emperor Charles V. He dreamed of conquest, of glory on the battlefield, of England reborn as a power equal to the giants of Europe. The court became a stage for his ambitions, where scholars debated philosophy, poets praised his deeds, and painters immortalized his image. The king himself was both actor and director in this great performance. But there was a duality in Henry's character that would shape his reign. The outward magnificence concealed an inner hunger for power, for legacy, for the certainty of control. He was generous to friends, but ruthless to enemies, quick to charm, yet quicker to punish betrayal. His laughter could fill a hall, but his wrath could end a life. Henry was a man of passions, and those passions, once inflamed, became unstoppable forces. In his early years, this passion gave him vitality. He burned to lead his armies into France, dreaming of recapturing the glories of the medieval kings. He sought the prestige of the great tournaments, reveling in the thunder of horses and the clash of lances. He threw himself into theology, writing against Martin Luther and earning from the Pope the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. For a time he seemed the perfect union of warrior, scholar, and king. Yet within him lay the seeds of conflict. His obsession with honor, with producing a male heir, with leaving behind a dynasty that would endure, these would drive him to break with Rome, to execute friends and queens, to bend his kingdom to his will. The radiant youth who had once seemed England's golden prince would, in time, become one of its most formidable and feared monarchs. For now, however, in those first years after 1509, Henry VIII appeared to be a figure of hope. To his people, he was the embodiment of energy and possibility, a monarch whose court shimmered with music, light, and ambition. To foreign ambassadors, he was a prince to be reckoned with, a player on the European stage whose ambitions could not be underestimated. And to history, he was already a paradox, the beloved young king whose hunger for greatness would make him immortal, and whose passions would lead England into both triumph and terror. But beneath the glow of tournaments, music, and royal splendor, a darker question whispered through the corridors of power. Could this dazzling young king secure the one thing his dynasty needed most? A son, marriage, and the succession crisis. The marriage of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon began as a union of hope and alliance. Their wedding in 1509 was celebrated with processions and pageantry, the young king and queen appearing as if born for one another. Catherine, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, brought with her not only royal prestige, but the aura of faith and endurance. She had once been married to Henry's elder brother, Arthur, who died before their marriage could be consummated. Now she stood beside Henry, radiant and steadfast, a queen who embodied dignity and piety. For the first years, their union seemed blessed. The court admired Catherine's wisdom, her devotion, and her ability to temper Henry's restless energy with patience. Together they projected the image of stability, a golden couple leading a kingdom into renewal. But beneath the triumphal surface lay an anxious question, one that haunted every royal marriage in an age of dynasties. Would this union produce a male heir? The answer was cruel. Catherine bore Henry several children, but most died in infancy. Sons were born only to be buried within weeks. The king watched cradle after cradle fall silent, each death a dagger to his pride and hope. Only one child survived, Mary, born in 1516. Though healthy, she was a daughter, and to Henry this was not enough. He wanted a son, an heir who could secure the Tudor line, protect the fragile dynasty, and continue the legacy he believed destined for him. The obsession with a male heir grew into a shadow that darkened the marriage. In a Europe filled with turmoil, the security of a dynasty depended on continuity. Without a male successor, the kingdom risked another civil war, another Bosworth, another descent into chaos. Henry knew this intimately, for his own father had risen from the ashes of such conflict. He could not bear the thought of the Tudors, so newly crowned, collapsing into dust for want of a boy. Catherine, steadfast and devout, endured these trials with grace. Yet Henry's patience began to fray. By the 1520s, he was approaching middle age, still without a male heir. Whispers spread through the court. Perhaps God withheld his blessing because Henry had married his brother's widow, violating sacred law. The king himself came to believe it. He pored over Leviticus, finding in its lines a justification for his plight. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. To Henry, this was no longer chance but divine judgment. It was at this moment that another figure entered the stage, Anne Boleyn. Young, intelligent, and alluring, Anne captivated Henry with her wit and her refusal to yield easily to his advances. Unlike others at court, she would not be merely a mistress. She held herself apart, demanding more. To Henry, this was intoxicating. Anne became the embodiment of possibility, not only the woman who stirred his heart, but the one who might give him the son fate had denied him. Thus, the marriage that had once seemed a triumph turned into a crisis. Henry's longing for Anne fused with his desperation for a male heir, and together they became an irresistible force. He petitioned the Pope for an annulment, claiming his marriage to Catherine had been invalid from the beginning. Catherine resisted fiercely. She refused to yield, asserting her dignity as queen and as daughter of Spain. To concede would mean admitting her marriage was unlawful, her daughter illegitimate, her crown undeserved. The stage was set for a struggle that would reverberate far beyond the royal bedchamber. The papacy, caught between England and Catherine's powerful nephew, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, hesitated and delayed. But Henry was not a man to accept hesitation. His personal anguish had become a matter of state, his private longing transformed into a political storm. The succession crisis was no longer just about one marriage. It was about the future of England, the authority of the Pope, and the very unity of Christendom. In the grand halls of Westminster and the cloisters of Rome, arguments swirled. Was Henry a husband bound by sacred law, or a king entrusted with the fate of a realm? Could the Pope undo what God had seemingly cursed? Each passing year sharpened the urgency. Mary was growing older, still the only living child. Anne remained the tantalizing promise of renewal. And Henry grew more determined, convinced that destiny itself demanded he break free. The marriage of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon had begun as a pageant of hope. It ended as the crucible of a crisis that would transform England forever. For from this personal struggle, this king's longing for a son, his passion for another woman, his defiance of papal authority, would emerge a rupture that shattered the medieval world. The seeds of Reformation, dissolution, and a new English church were sown in the silence of those empty cradles and the fiery gaze of a king who could not accept failure. What had begun as a royal love story had become a drama of dynastic survival, a conflict between faith and desire, between tradition and ambition. It was the point at which the personal became political, and the fate of one man's marriage set the course for an entire nation. What began as a king's desperate bid for a son had now outgrown the marriage bed, spilling into the realm of politics, faith, and destiny itself. And in that widening storm, Henry's struggle with Catherine would ignite a confrontation with Rome. The break with Rome. The quest for an annulment had begun as a matter of conscience and succession. By the mid-1520s, it had become an all-consuming storm. Henry VIII, once hailed as defender of the faith, now found himself locked in bitter struggle with the very institution he had sworn to protect. The Pope's refusal to grant him freedom from Catherine of Aragon transformed a private dilemma into a conflict that would alter the spiritual map of Europe. At first, Henry sought resolution within the established order. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, his powerful chancellor and the most influential churchman in England, was dispatched to secure papal approval. But Wolsey's brilliance faltered before the reality of politics. Pope Clement VII was effectively a prisoner of Catherine's nephew, the Emperor Charles V, whose armies had sacked Rome in 1527. To defy Catherine was to provoke Charles, the most formidable ruler in Christendom. And so the Pope stalled, prevaricated, and delayed. Years passed, and with them Henry's patience wore thin. The king's frustration grew fevered. He was no longer the golden prince of his youth, but a man driven by obsession. His passion for Anne Boleyn intensified, his need for a male heir sharpened into desperation. Courtiers whispered that the king was bewitched, others that he was divinely chosen to cleanse England of Rome's corruption. Whatever the truth, Henry's will hardened. If the Pope would not release him, he would release himself. The machinery of rupture moved slowly but inexorably. Scholars and clerics were summoned to justify the king's case. Men like Thomas Cranmer argued that royal authority, not papal decree, should guide England's faith. Parliamentary acts began to chip away at Rome's influence. Statutes restricting payments to the papacy, measures asserting the independence of the English clergy. Each law was a chisel blow against the ancient edifice of Catholic supremacy. Then came the decisive stroke, the Act of Supremacy of 1534. By this act, Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. No longer would the Pope's authority extend across the Channel. The king now stood not only as ruler of the realm, but as shepherd of its souls. What had once been a plea for annulment had become a revolution of sovereignty. The consequences were seismic. Catherine of Aragon was cast aside, her marriage declared void, her daughter Mary stripped of legitimacy. Anne Boleyn was crowned queen, her swelling belly a promise of the son Henry craved. Monks and priests across the land swore oaths of loyalty to the king's supremacy. Those who refused, like Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, paid with their lives. their heads falling beneath the axe on Tower Hill. Henry's break with Rome was not merely a legal maneuver, it was a transformation of identity. England was no longer one kingdom among many beneath the Pope's umbrella. It had become an island church, tied to the crown rather than to Rome, its destiny bound to the will of the monarch. For ordinary men and women, the change was bewildering. Altars looked the same, the Mass still spoken in Latin, the sacraments unchanged. Yet behind the familiar rituals, an earthquake had shifted the ground. The king, not the Pope, was now the bridge between heaven and earth. The political stakes were enormous. European rulers watched in shock and anger as Henry defied the Pope. To Charles V, the insult to his Aunt Catherine was intolerable. To the papacy, England's defiance was heresy. The threat of invasion loomed, and Henry braced his kingdom for isolation. Yet the king pressed on, convinced that destiny and necessity alike demanded it. Perhaps the most dramatic expression of this new order came in the dissolution of the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1541, the crown seized the wealth of England's abbeys, priories, and convents. Centuries of monastic tradition were swept away, libraries scattered, treasures melted, lands sold. To Henry, this was both practical and symbolic. The riches filled his coffers, strengthening the crown. But it also struck at the heart of papal influence, dismantling the very institutions that had bound England to Rome. It was a violent liberation, dressed in the language of reform but driven by the appetites of power. The once pious king who had written against Luther was now condemned across Europe as a tyrant and apostate. Yet to his supporters, Henry was a new Moses, delivering England from foreign domination, making the monarchy supreme. The break with Rome was not the act of a single day, but the culmination of years of conflict, passion, and resolve. It was born in the silence of Catherine's empty cradles, sharpened in the fire of Henry's desire for Anne Boleyn, and forged in the clash between papal power and royal will. By severing England from Rome, Henry VIII set his kingdom on a new path, one that would lead to turmoil, bloodshed, and eventual transformation. The cost was high, the upheaval immense, but the king had achieved what he desired. He had freed himself from Catherine. He had taken Anne as his queen. And above all, he had claimed for himself a power no English king had dared before, the right to command not only his subjects' bodies, but their souls. In that moment, England ceased to be merely a Catholic kingdom on Europe's fringe. It became something new, something uncertain, something perilous, a nation reborn in defiance, with a king at once savior and destroyer. Yet even as England was remade in defiance of Rome, the heart of its transformation remained deeply personal. For at the center of the storm stood a king whose private desires dictated the fate of his realm. And nowhere was this more evident than in the tale of his 6 wives. The marriages of Henry VIII. The story of Henry VIII cannot be told without the procession of women who became his queens. 6 marriages, each dramatic in its own right, formed the spine of his reign. They were not mere romances, but acts of state, political maneuvers entwined with personal desire, dynastic fear, and the king's insatiable hunger for control. Behind the splendor of coronations and the whispers of courtly intrigue lay a relentless pattern of hope and disillusionment, of passion ignited and extinguished, of crowns placed and torn away. Anne Boleyn, the catalyst. Anne Boleyn was the spark that lit the conflagration with Rome. For 7 years, Henry pursued her with a fervor that consumed both his marriage and his conscience. She was unlike any woman he had known, educated in the French court, clever, ambitious, unwilling to yield. She refused the role of mistress, insisting on the crown itself. To Henry, she represented destiny, the woman who would bear him the longed-for son. In 1533, after breaking with Rome, Henry married Anne in defiance of the Pope. She was crowned queen in a ceremony heavy with symbolism, her belly already swelling with pregnancy. But expectation soon turned to despair. Anne's child, born in September, was a daughter, Elizabeth. Though destined to become one of England's greatest monarchs, at the time she was a bitter disappointment. 2 more pregnancies ended in miscarriage, one said to be a boy lost too soon. Henry's passion turned sour, love curdling into suspicion. Anne, once the king's obsession, became his target. Accusations of adultery, treason, and even witchcraft swirled around her. In May 1536, she was tried and condemned. The woman for whom a kingdom had been torn from Rome was led to the scaffold at the Tower of London. Her fall was swift and brutal, a chilling testament to Henry's merciless resolve. Jane Seymour. The brief fulfillment. Almost immediately, Henry turned to Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting who seemed Anne's opposite, gentle, modest, and pliant. She became his 3rd wife, just days after Anne's execution. In Jane, Henry found the serenity he long craved, and more importantly, the promise of a son. In October 1537, Jane delivered Edward, the long-awaited male heir. Bells rang across the kingdom, bonfires lit the night skies. Henry, overwhelmed with joy, called him the greatest treasure ever granted to his house. But the triumph was fleeting. Jane died 12 days later from postnatal complications, leaving Henry bereft. To him, she remained his true wife, the only one to give him what he most desired. Her death cloaked his triumph in mourning, and her image haunted him for the rest of his life. Anne of Cleves, the political bargain. By the late 1530s, Henry sought not only companionship but alliance. Threatened by Catholic powers abroad, he turned to the Protestant states of Germany. A marriage to Anne of Cleves, sister of a German duke, promised security. The union was arranged by portrait. Hans Holbein painted Anne's likeness, which charmed the king. But when Anne arrived in England, Henry recoiled. He complained bitterly of her appearance, calling her a Flanders mare. Though the marriage took place in January 1540, Henry quickly sought to dissolve it. Within months, it was annulled on grounds of non-consummation. Anne, pragmatic and wise, accepted the settlement, living out her days in comfort as the king's beloved sister. The political bond dissolved as quickly as the marriage itself, but Anne survived where others had perished. Catherine Howard, the reckless flame. Henry's 5th marriage was to Catherine Howard, a young cousin of Anne Boleyn. Barely a teenager, Catherine embodied youthful vitality that seemed to revive the aging king. Obese, plagued by ulcers, and burdened by age, Henry basked in the adoration of his rose without a thorn. But Catherine's youth carried danger. Rumors of her past indiscretions reached the court, soon followed by evidence of infidelity during the marriage itself. To Henry, who had endured humiliation and betrayal before, this was intolerable. Catherine was arrested, condemned, and executed in 1542. Her tragic figure, once playful and radiant, went to the block weeping, a sacrifice to Henry's unrelenting pursuit of loyalty and order. Catherine Parr, the survivor. The final chapter of Henry's marital saga belonged to Catherine Parr. Twice widowed, intelligent, and devout, she was more companion than passion. Catherine acted as nurse to the ailing king, stepmother to his children, and even regent when Henry campaigned in France. She encouraged the education of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Edward, fostering the intellectual currents that would shape their reigns. Unlike her predecessors, Catherine Parr managed to outlive the king. She navigated the treacherous politics of the court, balancing her Protestant sympathies with caution. She was nearly undone by accusations of heresy, but skillfully reconciled with Henry. When the king died in 1547, Catherine stood not as victim, but as survivor, the last queen of a man whose hunger for wives had consumed so many. The pattern of power and loss. The 6 marriages of Henry VIII formed a grim refrain. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Each queen reflected a different aspect of the king's desire: passion, security, politics, youth, companionship. Each revealed the peril of standing too close to his throne. For Henry, marriage was never private. It was the crucible in which dynasties were forged and broken, in which the fate of the realm was intertwined with the intimacy of the bedchamber. Through these unions, Henry reshaped England itself. The annulment from Catherine of Aragon shattered ties with Rome. The passion for Anne Boleyn birthed a new church. Jane Seymour delivered the heir who would carry on the Tudor name. The failures of Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard exposed the volatility of his rule, and Catherine Parr ensured that his legacy would pass, educated and prepared, into the hands of his children. Henry's marriages were not merely the story of a king and his wives. They were the theater of a dynasty, the battlefield upon which religion, politics, and passion clashed. In the end, the king who sought love and sons found only fleeting satisfaction and lasting turmoil. Yet from the wreckage of his marriages emerged the foundations of modern England, a nation severed from Rome, ruled by a crown that commanded both state and church, and prepared, through blood and fire, for the reigns of his remarkable children. But the echoes of Henry's marriages did not stop at the walls of his palace. They spilled into every church and village across the land, turning private desire into public upheaval. From the wreckage of his queens arose something far greater: the English Reformation. The religious Reformation and its consequences. The break with Rome did not end with a crown placed upon Anne Boleyn's head or the Act of Supremacy signed into law. It set in motion a transformation that reverberated through every parish, monastery, and hearth in England. The English Reformation was not merely a theological debate, but a revolution of land, wealth, and power. It was as if the kingdom itself had been torn up by its roots and replanted in new soil. What began as Henry's quest for a son became a seismic upheaval that reshaped the nation's soul: the dissolution of the monasteries. At the heart of the Reformation stood the monasteries. For centuries, they had been pillars of English life, centers of prayer, charity, and learning. Monks tilled fields, preserved manuscripts, and offered alms to the poor. Their abbeys dotted the landscape, from towering cathedrals to humble priories nestled in valleys. To the common eye, they seemed eternal. But to Henry and his advisers, especially Thomas Cromwell, they were symbols of papal wealth and rivals to royal authority. Their lands covered a quarter of England. Their treasures were vast. To dissolve them was to cripple Rome's influence and enrich the crown. Beginning in 1536, commissions were sent out to inspect monastic houses. Reports came back, some true, others exaggerated, of corruption, idleness, and vice. These became the justification for destruction. One by one, monasteries were closed, their monks pensioned off or scattered. Altars were stripped, relics cast aside, libraries sold by the cartload. The great abbeys of Glastonbury, Fountains, and Tintern fell into ruin, their stones carted away or left as silent skeletons against the sky. Lands once held in trust for God passed into the hands of courtiers and gentry, creating a new class of landowners loyal to the crown. The wealth of the church flowed into royal coffers, financing wars, palaces, and the machinery of power. For the king, it was triumph. For the nation, trauma. Villagers mourned the loss of familiar sanctuaries, the disappearance of monks who had baptized their children and buried their dead. Hospitals and schools, once supported by monastic charity, collapsed. England's spiritual landscape had been irrevocably altered. The Henrician Church. Yet Henry's Reformation was not a clean break into Protestantism. Unlike Luther in Germany or Calvin in Geneva, Henry did not reject the sacraments, the Mass, or much of Catholic ritual. He loathed heresy as fiercely as he loathed papal control. The Church of England under Henry remained Catholic in form, but with the king, not the Pope, at its head. Latin prayers filled the air, candles still burned on altars, but loyalty was sworn to the crown. This ambiguity left England in uneasy tension. Reformers pushed for deeper change, eager to bring English worship into line with the new theology sweeping Europe. Conservatives clung to the old ways, unwilling to surrender centuries of tradition. The king himself swayed between them, sometimes embracing reformist measures, other times enforcing strict orthodoxy. Those who strayed too far, be they Protestant radicals or stubborn Catholics, faced prison, exile, or the block. Resistance and rebellion. The Reformation did not proceed without resistance. In 1536, the north of England erupted in the Pilgrimage of Grace. Tens of thousands of rebels, carrying banners of the 5 wounds of Christ, marched against the king's policies, demanding the restoration of monasteries and the defense of the old faith. For a moment, it seemed the kingdom might fracture. Henry responded with guile and brutality. He promised pardon, only to later arrest the leaders. Executions followed. Abbots hanged from their own gates, noblemen dragged to their deaths. The rebellion was crushed, but its memory lingered as a testament to the depth of devotion that still bound many to Rome. The consequences for crown and people. The consequences of Henry's Reformation stretched far beyond religion. By seizing monastic lands, Henry created a new aristocracy of wealth, the gentry class, whose fortunes were tied to the survival of the new order. They became defenders of the Tudor crown, their loyalty purchased with former church estates. The economic map of England shifted as ancient religious lands became fields for sheep, fueling a growing wool trade that would enrich the kingdom. Politically, Henry's authority swelled. No longer constrained by papal interference, the crown stood supreme. Parliament, once marginal, became a central tool, passing laws that enshrined the king's supremacy and reshaped the realm's governance. The idea of royal power fused with national identity, England portrayed as a sovereign kingdom under God, answerable to none but its monarch. Culturally, the rupture left scars. The destruction of monasteries meant the loss of centuries of art, manuscripts, and architecture. Knowledge was scattered, heritage erased. Yet out of this void rose something new. An English identity forged in defiance of Rome, proud of its independence, suspicious of foreign influence. The seeds of nationalism, watered in blood and fire, began to take root. The shadow of uncertainty. For all its triumph, Henry's Reformation left deep uncertainty. The king had secured his supremacy, but not his dynasty. Anne Boleyn had given him a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son. Jane Seymour's Edward, born later, provided hope, but the future was fragile. Meanwhile, England itself was caught between two worlds, Catholic in ritual, Protestant in authority. The question of faith would not vanish with Henry's decrees. It would ignite again under his children, shaping the destinies of Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. For the moment, however, Henry stood victorious. He had torn down monasteries, humbled the Pope, and made himself master of England's church and crown. Yet beneath the glitter of his triumph lay the tremors of conflict to come. The Reformation had given him power beyond any English king before him, but it had also opened a rift in the soul of the nation, a rift that would take generations to heal. These unresolved tensions, between faith and authority, between triumph and fragility, would outlive Henry himself, becoming the very heart of the legacy he left to England, the political and cultural legacy of Henry VIII. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, the bells of England tolled not only for a king, but for an age. His reign had been one of spectacle and terror, triumph and ruin. Few monarchs had so indelibly stamped their will upon a nation. He left behind a fragile boy king, a fractured church, and a kingdom both enriched and exhausted. Yet in the ruins and the splendor alike, Henry's legacy was unmistakable. He had transformed England from a peripheral kingdom into a sovereign power, and he had reshaped its culture in ways that would echo for centuries. A monarchy transformed politically, Henry VIII emerged as one of the most formidable kings in English history. Where his father, Henry VII, had laid the foundations of Tudor authority with cautious frugality, Henry VIII built upon them with audacity. By severing ties with Rome, he made the crown supreme over both state and church. Parliament, once a modest body, became a vital instrument of royal policy, passing acts that gave Henry's will the force of law. The idea that the king's authority came not from papal blessing, but from the sovereign will of God and Parliament, was revolutionary. Through the dissolution of the monasteries, Henry redistributed immense wealth and land, forging a new ruling class. The gentry and nobility who enriched themselves on church lands became tied to the survival of the Tudor order. This network of power, anchored in loyalty bought with former monastic estates, secured the monarchy against rebellion. The political map of England was redrawn. The crown stood higher, the pope diminished, and the aristocracy reordered. Yet Henry's rule was also marked by fear. His reign was one of executions and purges. Ministers, queens, nobles, and churchmen who displeased him or threatened his power met the axe. Loyalty was precarious, and the court itself became a theater of intrigue, where a smile could turn to suspicion overnight. The memory of Tower Hill, stained with the blood of Sir Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and Thomas Cromwell, lingered long after Henry's death. His legacy was not only one of power, but of the reminder that power could devour its servants. A cultural renaissance. If Henry ruled with iron, he also gilded his age with gold. The court of Henry VIII was a Renaissance stage, dazzling with music, poetry, and art. He himself was a patron of culture, composing songs, playing instruments, and surrounding himself with scholars and artists. He collected tapestries and armor, filled his palaces with splendor, and made court life a spectacle of magnificence. The English Renaissance, still in its infancy, blossomed under his rule. Humanist scholars such as Erasmus found welcome at his court, and education was encouraged among the nobility. Henry founded new institutions, including Trinity College at Cambridge, fostering learning that would outlast his dynasty. Printing presses multiplied, spreading not only royal decrees but literature, theology, and polemic. The written word became a weapon as potent as the sword, shaping the nation's debates on faith and authority. Architecture bore his mark as well. Henry expanded palaces like Hampton Court and built grand residences that projected royal magnificence. Their towering halls, intricate gardens, and vast kitchens reflected both the majesty of kingship and the appetite of the king himself. In their stone and timber, one could see the ambition of a monarch who wanted England to rival the splendor of France or Spain. A nation redefined. Perhaps Henry's greatest cultural legacy was the forging of a distinct English identity. By rejecting Rome, he set England apart from continental Christendom. This was more than theology. It was a declaration of sovereignty. The nation became accustomed to the idea of independence, of standing alone against larger European powers. Out of the king's personal quarrel with the Pope grew a national consciousness that saw England not as a follower of Rome, but as a realm with its own destiny. This redefinition came at a cost. The Reformation fractured communities, set neighbor against neighbor, and left scars that his successors would inherit. Yet it also created the conditions for a flowering of thought and expression. The seeds sown in Henry's time would bloom in the Elizabethan age. The plays of Shakespeare, the voyages of Drake, the pride of a people who saw themselves as chosen for greatness. The dynastic shadow. For all his grandeur, Henry's political legacy remained haunted by fragility. His desperate quest for a son revealed the deep insecurity of the Tudor line. Though Edward VI succeeded him, the boy's frailty foreshadowed instability. Mary and Elizabeth stood as heirs, but their legitimacy had been contested. their fates uncertain. In his obsession with dynasty, Henry had torn through marriages, broken with Rome, and spilled blood across England. And yet the future remained precarious. His reign was thus both triumph and tragedy. Triumph in the creation of a strong, centralized monarchy and an independent church. Tragedy in the division, fear, and uncertainty he left behind. The image of the king, above all, Henry VIII left the image of kingship itself transformed. No longer was the monarch a distant figure bound by tradition. Henry was larger than life. Warrior, musician, scholar, tyrant. His presence dominated his age, his portrait by Hans Holbein projecting the essence of royal majesty. Legs planted wide, gaze unflinching, a colossus draped in jewels and furs. That image endured long after his death. To his subjects, Henry became both the symbol of power's glory and its danger. To history, he stood as a paradox. The king who built and destroyed, who defended the faith and shattered the church, who sought love but left a trail of broken queens. The echo of his age. When the coffin of Henry VIII was borne to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, it carried more than a body. It carried the contradictions of an era, splendor and ruin, faith and heresy, unity and division. His reign was not a steady march but a series of thunderclaps, each reshaping the sky above England. In the silence after his death, the kingdom stood at a crossroads. The boy King Edward would inherit the throne, but it was Henry's shadow that loomed over him. The political and cultural legacy of Henry VIII was not simply that of a monarch, it was the transformation of England itself, a kingdom now irreversibly set on a path of sovereignty, reformation, and ambition. Henry VIII had ruled not only with a crown, but with a stage, a spectacle that burned itself into the memory of his people. And though his body lay in stone, his presence remained. A king immortalized not in peace or piety, but in the very turbulence that defined his age. Yet even as the earth closed over Henry's coffin, his restless legacy did not rest. It passed, unsoftened, into the small and trembling hands of his only son, Edward VI, the child king and his council. When Henry VIII's coffin was lowered into the vaults of St. George's Chapel in January 1547, the eyes of England turned to a boy. Edward VI, not yet 10 years old, inherited not only a crown heavy with jewels, but the crushing weight of his father's tumultuous reign. Frail in body but precocious in mind, Edward was a child of the Reformation, raised amid sermons, tutors, and the austere devotion of Protestant zeal. To the kingdom, he appeared as both promise and peril, the long-awaited male heir of the Tudors, yet too young to rule a land trembling on the edge of change. The boy king, Edward was unlike his father in almost every respect. Where Henry had been towering, boisterous, and larger than life, Edward was slight, pale, and sickly. Chroniclers described his sharp intelligence, his love of learning, his devotion to scripture. He read Latin fluently, translated works of theology, and wrote his own meditations on faith. He was earnest where Henry had been flamboyant, studious where Henry had been tempestuous. Yet Edward possessed the unyielding certainty of youth, a conviction that the doctrines he had imbibed were not only true, but divinely ordained. But Edward was a child, and kingship is no child's game. Real power fell to his council, first to his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who styled himself Lord Protector. Somerset was a soldier, a man of ambition who had fought in Scotland and dreamed of forging an Anglo-Scottish union through conquest. Yet he was also a reformer, eager to push England further down the path of Protestantism. The council and the Protector Somerset's rule was marked by both boldness and blunder. He advanced Protestant reform with zeal, introducing the Book of Common Prayer in 1549, a liturgy in English that swept away centuries of Latin tradition. Altars were stripped, images destroyed, and churches remade into austere halls of prayer. For reformers, this was liberation. For traditionalists, it was sacrilege. At the same time, Somerset pursued costly wars against Scotland, seeking to force a marriage alliance between young Edward and Mary, Queen of Scots. His armies won bloody victories, but the campaigns drained the treasury and achieved little lasting success. The kingdom groaned under new taxes, debasement of the coinage, and inflation that left common folk desperate. Discontent erupted in 1549 in a wave of rebellion. In Norfolk, thousands of peasants rose under Robert Kett, protesting enclosures that robbed them of common lands. In the West, Cornishmen rebelled against the new liturgy, demanding the restoration of the Latin Mass. England, barely 2 years into Edward's reign, seemed on the brink of collapse. Somerset, once hailed as the protector, was now seen as reckless. In 1549, his rivals on the council, led by John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, turned against him. Somerset was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually executed. The boy king, watching from the sidelines, saw how quickly power devoured those who held it in his name. The Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, who became Duke of Northumberland, now controlled the kingdom. Where Somerset had been idealistic and impulsive, Northumberland was calculating, pragmatic, and ruthless. He tightened the crown's finances, stabilized the realm, and continued Protestant reforms with a sharper edge. Under his guidance, Edward's England became more thoroughly Protestant than ever before. The Book of Common Prayer was revised in 1552 into an even starker form, stripping away vestiges of Catholic belief. Saints' days were abolished, vestments discarded, altars replaced with wooden tables. The Mass of Henry VIII's church, half Catholic in form, was swept aside. England was remade into a nation of the Word, its churches echoing not with incense but with scripture in the common tongue. For Edward, this was a mission as much as policy. He saw himself as a second Josiah, the biblical boy king who purified Israel of idolatry. Though small and frail, Edward's will was fierce. He attended sermons, annotated religious tracts, and believed with unshakable certainty that God had chosen him to complete the work his father had begun. He was, in his own way, the most zealous Protestant ever to sit on England's throne. The shadow of mortality. Yet Edward's body betrayed him. Always delicate, he grew weaker as he entered his teenage years. By 1553, it was clear the boy king was dying, likely of tuberculosis. His thin frame wasted away, his cough racked his body, but his mind remained fixed on the future of his faith. To Edward, the greatest danger was not death itself, but what might follow it. His half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was a devout Catholic. If she inherited the throne, she would undo all his reforms, restore papal authority, and plunge England back into the embrace of Rome. Edward could not allow it. Under Northumberland's influence, Edward drafted a devise for the succession, excluding both Mary and Elizabeth, declaring them illegitimate. Instead, he named Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, as heir. Jane was scholarly, virtuous, and firmly Protestant, an ideal successor in Edward's eyes. It was a desperate gamble, an attempt by a dying boy to secure the triumph of his faith beyond his grave. The passing of the prince. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553. He was only 15 years old. London's bells tolled for a king who had reigned 6 years, but whose shadow loomed larger than his age. To reformers, his death was a tragedy, the snuffing out of a candle that had burned with holy fire. To Catholics, it was the hand of God, ending the reign of heresy. In the days that followed, Jane Grey was proclaimed queen, the fragile pawn of Edward's final will. But the kingdom did not accept her. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, rallied supporters, and within 9 days Jane was overthrown. Edward's dream of a Protestant succession crumbled, and his reforms stood on the edge of reversal. The legacy of Edward VI. Edward VI was a boy whose reign was lived through others, yet whose convictions were entirely his own. Though he never led an army or commanded a council unaided, his piety and certainty drove England further down the path of reformation than his father had dared. He stripped the Church of Catholic remnants, empowered Protestant preachers, and made the English Bible the heart of worship. But his reign was also one of turmoil, rebellion, economic hardship, and political intrigue. The kingdom, reshaped so violently, remained fragile. Edward's brief life symbolized both the promise and the peril of the Tudor experiment, a monarch consumed by faith, yet consumed in turn by mortality. The boy who dreamed of purifying England died young, leaving behind a kingdom at war with itself. His legacy would not be measured in years, but in the battles of conscience and creed that followed. For in his short reign, Edward VI had sown the seeds of a conflict that would tear England apart under his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. Thus, when Edward's frail body gave way to death, the kingdom did not find rest. It found itself hurled into a succession crisis that would thrust another child, Lady Jane Grey, onto the blood-stained stage of Tudor destiny. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen. The death of Edward VI in July 1553 unleashed a storm upon England. Behind palace walls and in council chambers, the fate of the kingdom hung by a thread. Edward's final act, a devise for the succession, excluding his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, had been meant to secure the Protestant Reformation he held sacred. But in bypassing the rightful line, he had set in motion a drama of ambition, betrayal, and tragedy. At the center of this storm stood Lady Jane Grey, a girl of 16, intelligent, devout, and entirely unprepared for the crown thrust upon her. She was Edward's cousin, the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, and a staunch Protestant. Raised in a household of rigorous piety and classical learning, Jane read Greek and Latin, debated theology with scholars, and embraced the Reformation with a fervor rare even among her tutors. Yet she was also shy, modest, and wholly unsuited to the brutal world of Tudor politics. The plot for the throne. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, had orchestrated the plan. As Edward's chief minister, he feared that Mary's accession would undo a decade of Protestant reform and his own power. By marrying his son, Guildford Dudley, to Jane Grey, Northumberland bound her fate to his own. When Edward died, the council proclaimed Jane Queen, presenting her as the lawful heir by Edward's will. Jane herself was reluctant. Accounts suggest she wept when told of her elevation, insisting she was unworthy. But under pressure from her parents and Northumberland, she accepted the crown, driven more by duty than ambition. On July 10, 1553, she was proclaimed Queen of England. The 9 Days of Jane. For 9 days, Jane sat upon the throne. Yet her reign was more illusion than authority. She never entered the royal apartments, never held court in Westminster. Power remained in the hands of Northumberland and the council. The people were silent, neither rejoicing nor rising. Meanwhile, Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon and half-sister to Edward, was gathering support. Though declared illegitimate by Henry VIII, Mary was widely recognized as the rightful heir under the Third Succession Act. Her Catholic faith and royal blood drew thousands to her side. From her estates in East Anglia, she rode out, rallying nobles and commoners alike. The tide turned swiftly. Members of the council, sensing the wind, abandoned Jane. Northumberland, leading troops to intercept Mary, found himself without support. Within days, the plot collapsed. On July 19th, the council proclaimed Mary Queen. London erupted in celebration. Jane's reign was over. The fall Jane was arrested, her crown stripped before it had even settled on her head. She and her husband were imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had been proclaimed queen. Mary, now triumphant, faced a choice: mercy or execution. Initially, she chose mercy. Jane was a pawn, not a conspirator. But events soon spiraled. In early 1554, a rebellion led by Sir Thomas Wyatt sought to depose Mary and place Elizabeth on the throne. Though Jane took no part, The uprising sealed her fate. To Mary's counsel, Jane remained a symbol, a Protestant figurehead who might inspire further revolt. Her continued existence was a threat. On February 12, 1554, Lady Jane Grey was led to the scaffold. She wore a simple gown, her face calm, her steps steady. Before the assembled crowd, she declared her guilt only in accepting a crown she had not sought. Then, blindfolded, she knelt, reciting the psalm, "Into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe fell, and with it ended the life of England's 9 days queen. A legacy of tragedy. Jane's story became legend, a tale of innocence caught in the gears of power. To Protestants, she was a martyr, a victim of Catholic tyranny, a symbol of youthful virtue destroyed by political necessity. To history, she was the embodiment of the human cost of Tudor ambition. Her reign, though fleeting, revealed the fragility of succession and the peril of faith in a divided realm. It marked the final attempt to impose a Protestant monarch against the will of bloodline and tradition. Mary's victory restored the rightful line, but at a price that would haunt her reign. In the shadow of Jane's fall, England entered a new chapter, one of restoration, retribution, and fire. The Marian Age had begun, and the flames of Smithfield would soon light the sky. And so, as Jane's crown slipped away with her life, the stage cleared for Mary Tudor, the rightful heir, whose arrival in London would turn sorrow into jubilation, even as it carried the promise of a reign shadowed by fire. Mary I, 1553 to 1558. When Mary Tudor rode into London in August 1553, the city erupted in celebration. Bells pealed from every steeple, crowds thronged the streets, and the daughter of Catherine of Aragon was hailed as England's rightful queen. For the first time in the nation's history, a woman ruled not as consort, but in her own name. Draped in crimson velvet, her face pale but resolute, Mary embodied both the triumph of legitimacy and the hopes of countless subjects weary of uncertainty. Yet within the triumph lay seeds of tragedy. Her reign, though brief, would become one of the most contested in English history, marked by devotion, defiance, and the fires of persecution. The restoration of the old faith. Mary was 37 when she took the throne. No longer a young princess, but a woman seasoned by years of humiliation. Declared illegitimate during her father Henry VIII's divorce from her mother, sidelined in favor of younger siblings, she had endured isolation with steadfast faith. That faith, Catholic, devout, uncompromising, was the core of her being. She believed her rise to power was divine providence, proof that God had vindicated her and her mother's cause. Almost immediately, Mary moved to restore England to Rome. Edward VI's Protestant reforms were repealed. The Latin Mass returned. Priests who had taken wives were forced to abandon them. In 1554, Cardinal Reginald Pole arrived from Rome as papal legate, and England was formally reconciled with the Pope. To Mary, this was not merely policy, but redemption. The schism her father had wrought was healed. The wound of her mother's dishonor was avenged, but the price was division. For many, especially in the South and East, Protestantism had taken root too deeply to be uprooted. Preachers, artisans, and scholars resisted quietly at first, then openly. To Mary, such defiance was not conscience, but heresy, and heresy was a cancer that must be burned away. The Marian persecutions. In February 1555, the first Protestant martyrs were burned at the stake. Over the next 3 years, nearly 300 men and women, bishops, ministers, artisans, even humble villagers, were executed by fire. Among them were leading figures of the Reformation, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. Their deaths, seared into memory, would define Mary's reign. The burnings were public, staged in marketplaces and town squares. Flames roared, smoke choked the air, and the cries of the condemned echoed through the crowd. Some recanted in terror, but many died proclaiming their faith, clutching the words of Scripture until the fire consumed them. To Mary, this was justice, souls saved from damnation by purging error from the land. To her opponents, it was tyranny, a cruelty that turned sympathy for the Queen into revulsion. The Queen's enemies gave her a name that would outlast her lifetime: Bloody Mary. Whether fair or not, the epithet captured the indelible image of firelit martyrdom that her reign etched upon the English mind. The Spanish marriage. Mary's policies were not confined to religion. In 1554, she married Philip of Spain, son of the powerful Emperor Charles V. The union was meant to strengthen England's Catholic restoration and anchor it within the might of Habsburg Europe. The wedding at Winchester was a glittering spectacle, yet the match was deeply unpopular. To many Englishmen, Philip represented foreign domination. Fears spread that England would become a satellite of Spain, its wealth drained, its independence lost. Parliament imposed conditions limiting Philip's power, but resentment lingered. Mary, devoted to her husband, found herself isolated. When Philip left for the continent, she remained behind, yearning for his return, her heart tethered to a man whose ambitions stretched far beyond England. The marriage also raised hopes of an heir. Twice, Mary believed herself pregnant, and twice she endured the agony of false expectation. The swelling of her belly, the preparations for childbirth, the anticipation of a prince, all dissolved into bitter disappointment. The Queen, who longed to secure the Tudor line with a Catholic successor, found herself childless, her body betraying her deepest hopes. Calais, the last continental loss. Mary's reign was also scarred by military failure. In 1557, at Philip's urging, England declared war on France. The conflict ended disastrously in January 1558, when Calais, England's last foothold on the continent, fell to French forces. For 2 centuries, Calais had symbolized England's claim to power in France. Its loss was a humiliation. Mary, broken-hearted, is said to have declared that when she died, the word Calais would be found engraved upon her heart. The Queen's decline. By 1558, Mary's health was failing. Pale, weary, and racked by illness, likely uterine cancer, she clung to the hope of bearing an heir even as her body wasted away. Philip remained distant, more concerned with the affairs of Spain and the Empire. Her people, disillusioned by burnings, taxes, and war, turned against her. On November 17, 1558, Mary died at St. James's Palace. She was 42 years old. Her crown passed to her half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the very woman Mary had despised. With her death, the Catholic restoration she had fought for collapsed, undone by the tide of her sister's Protestant reign. The legacy of Mary Tudor remains one of the most tragic figures in English history. To her supporters, she was a queen of courage and conviction, who sought to restore her people to the true faith and heal the breach with Rome. To her detractors, she was a tyrant whose fires stained the land with blood. Her reign was short but searing, remembered less for its successes than for its failures and cruelties. The burnings etched themselves into Protestant memory, fueling legends of martyrdom that would inspire resistance to Catholicism for generations. Her Spanish marriage deepened England's suspicion of foreign entanglements. Her military defeat at Calais symbolized loss and humiliation. Yet beneath the harsh judgments lies a woman of profound sincerity. Mary believed utterly in her mission. She ruled not for ambition or vanity, but for conscience. She sought to honor her mother, to defend her faith, to restore what she saw as divine order. In this, she was relentless, but the very qualities that gave her strength, her conviction, her refusal to compromise, also ensured her downfall. Mary's reign was a crucible in which England's religious future was tested. In 5 years, she burned for unity, but achieved division, fought for legacy, but left none, ruled with passion, but found herself remembered with fear. Yet without her, the triumph of her sister Elizabeth would have lacked its contrast. Mary's failure illuminated Elizabeth's success. Mary's fire cast Elizabeth's golden age into brighter relief. And so Mary I passed into history, queen regnant, Catholic crusader, victim of fate. Her reign was brief, her legacy contested, but her story remains a chapter of shadows and flames, where the hopes of restoration perished in smoke, and the crown passed once more into uncertain hands. And so, as the smoke of Mary's reign faded, England turned its gaze toward a new sovereign, Elizabeth, the daughter once cast aside, now called to heal a wounded kingdom and guide it into the light. Elizabeth I, the early years of her reign, 1558 to 1570. On November 17, 1558, a new dawn broke over England. In the quiet chambers of Hatfield, Elizabeth Tudor received word that her half-sister Mary was dead, and with those words came the crown. She was 25 years old, young, vibrant, and already hardened by the storms of her family's tumultuous past. The daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, once declared illegitimate and cast aside, now rose to the highest throne. As she knelt beneath an ancient oak tree in prayer, witnesses said she whispered the words of the Psalms, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." England itself was weary, fractured, and uncertain. The fires of Marian persecution still smoldered in memory. Calais had been lost to France, and the treasury stood drained. Yet with Elizabeth's accession, hope surged anew. To her people, she was more than a queen. She was a symbol of rebirth, the embodiment of a nation yearning for stability. A queen in her own right. Elizabeth's coronation in January 1559 was a spectacle of triumph and reconciliation. Processions wound through London streets, adorned with pageants that hailed her as Deborah, the biblical judge who delivered Israel, and as Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice. Crowds cheered, bells rang, and bonfires blazed into the winter night. Unlike her sister, Elizabeth entered her reign with the goodwill of her people, who saw in her youth and charisma a promise of renewal. But beneath the pageantry lay daunting challenges. Elizabeth inherited a kingdom divided by religion, hemmed in by powerful Catholic neighbors, and uncertain of its place in the world. France, allied with Scotland through the marriage of Mary, Queen of Scots, posed an immediate threat. Spain, under Philip II, Mary's widower and Europe's Catholic champion, watched her warily. At home, Catholics questioned her legitimacy, while Protestant reformers pressed her to dismantle every remnant of Rome. Elizabeth, astute and cautious, chose neither extreme. She understood that her survival depended not on zeal, but on balance. The religious settlement. In 1559, Parliament passed what became known as the Elizabethan Religious Settlement. The Act of Supremacy declared Elizabeth the supreme governor of the Church of England, a title carefully chosen to soothe anxieties about a woman usurping Christ's headship. The Act of Uniformity reintroduced the Book of Common Prayer in a form designed to accommodate both Protestant and Catholic sensibilities. Churches once again echoed with English liturgy, crucifixes were retained in some places, and clergy were allowed limited vestments. It was a compromise, too Catholic for radical reformers, too Protestant for traditionalists, but it provided the fragile foundation of stability. Elizabeth did not seek to make windows into men's souls. She sought outward conformity and inward peace. Yet, the settlement was not universally accepted. Catholic recusants refused attendance at Anglican services, risking fines and imprisonment. Protestant exiles returning from Geneva pushed for further reform, dissatisfied with Elizabeth's cautious moderation. The Queen, pragmatic and stubborn, resisted pressure from both sides. Her church was not to be dictated by Rome, Geneva, or Madrid. It was to be English. The question of marriage. If religion was Elizabeth's greatest challenge, marriage was her greatest question. As a young, unmarried queen, her body became a political battleground. Parliament urged her to wed, foreign princes courted her, and her counselors fretted over the succession. Would she marry for alliance, perhaps Philip of Spain, or the Archduke Charles of Austria, or for love, perhaps Robert Dudley, her childhood companion? Elizabeth turned the question into theater. She entertained suitors, encouraged speculation, and used her single state as a tool of diplomacy. But she refused to be bound. "I am already bound unto a husband," she declared, "which is the kingdom of England." In this, she crafted the image that would define her reign: the Virgin Queen, married not to man but to her people, the shadow of Mary, Queen of Scots. Looming over Elizabeth's early reign was her cousin, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. To Catholics, Mary was the rightful Queen of England, descended from Henry VII and untainted by the scandal of Anne Boleyn. Married to the French Dauphin, she seemed poised to unite Scotland, France, and Catholic legitimacy in a single figure. Coins were struck in France bearing Mary's image as Queen of England. Elizabeth recognized the danger. To her, Mary was not merely a cousin, but a living threat, a rallying point for Catholic plots. Yet Elizabeth, ever cautious, avoided open confrontation. She watched, waited, and prepared, knowing that one day Mary's presence would force her hand. Diplomacy and survival. Elizabeth's genius in these early years lay not in conquest, but in survival. She played the great powers of Europe against one another with delicate skill, offering her hand in marriage but never yielding, promising alliance but never entangling herself fully. With Cecil, her trusted secretary, she balanced budgets, restored the coinage, and carefully rebuilt the realm's stability. Her court became a center of culture and pageantry. Poets, musicians, and scholars thrived in her presence. She cultivated her image with care. Painted in rich gowns, her hand resting on a globe, she embodied both majesty and mystery. In her presence, courtiers saw not only a woman, but a symbol of sovereignty itself. The First Decade. By 1570, Elizabeth had secured her throne, but not her peace. Papal excommunication declared her a heretic and released her subjects from allegiance. Catholic plots simmered, Protestant demands grew sharper, and the shadow of Mary Stuart darkened the horizon. Yet Elizabeth endured. Her wit, her patience, and her ability to bend without breaking allowed her to navigate storms that might have destroyed another monarch. The girl, once cast aside as illegitimate, had risen into legend. She stood at the threshold of what would become known as the Elizabethan Age, a time of poets and pirates, of empire and defiance. But in those early years, her reign was not yet glory. It was survival, hard-won, and precarious. Elizabeth I began her rule as a queen walking a tightrope, the weight of a fractured kingdom pulling her down, the gaze of the world upon her. And yet she walked it with grace, her crown steady upon her head, her eyes fixed not on fear, but on the horizon of possibility. But survival was only the beginning, for as Elizabeth steadied her crown, darker currents gathered, and the next trials would come not from open battles, but from plots whispered in shadow. Plots and challenges. The crown Elizabeth wore glittered with promise, but its weight was forged of danger. The first decade of her reign had been marked by careful balance between Catholics and Protestants, peace and war, marriage and independence. Yet as the 1560s gave way to the 1570s, the shadows around her throne lengthened. Intrigue thickened in Europe's courts and in England's parishes. For Elizabeth, survival meant not only ruling a kingdom, but outwitting the webs of conspiracy that sought to ensnare her. The question of succession. At the heart of every plot against her lay the question of succession. Elizabeth had refused marriage, had no children, and was determined to rule alone. To her people, she was the Virgin Queen. To her enemies, she was a vulnerable monarch without an heir. If she died, who would take her place? The answer most often invoked was Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Catholic by birth, legitimate in lineage, and young enough to bear heirs, Mary represented both a rallying cry for English Catholics and a threat of foreign intervention. When Mary's husband, the French King Francis II, died in 1560, she returned to Scotland, bringing with her claims that directly challenged Elizabeth's crown. Elizabeth, cautious but resolute, understood the danger. Mary was not just a cousin, she was a living alternative, a queen anointed and crowned. To Catholic Europe, she was the rightful sovereign of England, and Elizabeth, the heretic usurper. The papal excommunication. In 1570, the storm broke. Pope Pius V issued the bull Regnans in Excelsis, declaring Elizabeth a heretic and releasing her subjects from allegiance. The document struck like thunder across Europe and England alike. It was more than condemnation. It was an invitation to rebellion, an endorsement of assassination. To Elizabeth, who had built her legitimacy on careful compromise, it was a dagger thrust at the heart of her reign. From that moment, her rule was not only contested, but criminalized in the eyes of Catholic powers. Spain, France, and Rome now saw her not as a queen to be negotiated with, but as a heretic to be removed. Catholic plots. Plots followed swiftly, each more dangerous than the last. The Ridolfi plot of 1571 sought to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, to the Duke of Norfolk and place her on England's throne with Spanish military support. Letters were intercepted, conspirators unmasked, and Norfolk sent to the block. Elizabeth, reluctant to shed royal blood, spared Mary for the moment. Other conspiracies followed, fueled by exiled priests and foreign gold. Secret masses were held in manor houses, coded letters smuggled through servants and sympathizers. Spies, networks, and informants became the tools of survival. Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spy master, turned intrigue into an art, uncovering plots before they ripened. The court became a place of masks and whispers, where loyalty was shadowed by fear. The challenge of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary herself proved both asset and liability to conspirators. Forced to flee Scotland after scandal and rebellion, she sought refuge in England in 1568. Elizabeth, torn between kinship and caution, imprisoned her. For nearly 2 decades, Mary lived as a captive queen, her presence a constant temptation to rebels and foreign powers. Elizabeth hesitated to strike decisively. To execute a fellow monarch would set a dangerous precedent. To release her would unleash chaos. And so Mary remained a prisoner, a living symbol, a flame sheltered yet dangerous, flickering at the edge of Elizabeth's reign. The Queen's tightrope. Every day of Elizabeth's rule was a balancing act. She walked between Protestant reformers demanding further change and Catholic subjects longing for Rome. She played France against Spain, courted suitors without marrying them, and wielded her image as both woman and sovereign with unmatched precision. But the plots and threats made her cautious to the point of steel. She trusted few, relied on Cecil and Walsingham, and learned to read the hidden motives in every smile at court. She cultivated mystery, wrapping herself in ritual, costume, and spectacle, transforming her vulnerability into majesty. Elizabeth's throne was a fortress built not of stone, but of vigilance, suspicion, and political theater. The cheers of her coronation still echoed, but around her the drums of conspiracy beat louder with each passing year. Yet the daggers once hidden in shadow soon gave way to open swords, and the careful game of plots and whispers erupted into the clash of nations, the pinnacle of politics and war. By the 1580s, Elizabeth's throne had endured 2 decades of conspiracy, diplomacy, and survival. Yet the shadows that once threatened in whispers now gathered into open storm clouds. Spain, the mightiest power in Europe, turned its gaze upon England. Philip II, who had once been Mary Tudor's husband, now became Elizabeth's greatest enemy. What had begun as religious rivalry deepened into political war, a clash not only of crowns, but of faiths, navies, and empires. The road to confrontation. The road to war was paved with years of tension. Elizabeth's cautious diplomacy had kept England out of direct conflict, but her support for Protestant rebels in the Netherlands and her privateering captains who plundered Spanish treasure fleets made hostility inevitable. Men like Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Walter Raleigh sailed across the seas under Elizabeth's discreet blessing, striking at the lifeblood of Spain's New World empire. Each raid filled English coffers and enraged Philip further. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots in 1587, pushed matters beyond repair. After years of hesitation, Elizabeth had finally signed her cousin's death warrant, convinced by Walsingham's evidence that Mary was complicit in the Babington plot to assassinate her. Mary's death removed a rallying point for English Catholics, but it also gave Philip the pretext he needed. He would avenge Mary, defend the Catholic faith, and overthrow the heretic queen. The Armada sets sail. In the summer of 1588, Spain unleashed its might. From Lisbon harbor, the Invincible Armada set sail, 130 ships, bristling with guns, carrying 30,000 men, its sails like a forest of white against the horizon. Its plan was bold: sail up the English Channel, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands, and invade England itself. News of the Armada's approach electrified England. Beacons blazed from hilltop to hilltop, carrying warning across the land. In London, citizens prayed, nobles armed, and Elizabeth herself prepared to inspire her people. Tilbury. The Queen's Speech. At Tilbury, as the Spanish threat loomed, Elizabeth rode among her assembled troops. Dressed in a white gown and silver breastplate, she appeared as both queen and warrior. Her words, carried on the wind, burned into memory. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England, too." The soldiers roared, and in that moment Elizabeth became more than sovereign. She became the embodiment of the nation itself. Fire and storm. The Armada met the English Navy in the Channel. English ships, lighter and more maneuverable, harassed the Spanish formation with relentless gunfire. Drake and Hawkins darted in and out, their cannon thunder echoing across the waves. The Spanish, disciplined but cumbersome, struggled to land a decisive blow. At Calais, the English unleashed fire ships, vessels set ablaze and sent drifting into the anchored Armada. Panic spread. Spanish ships cut their cables and scattered into open waters. The battle at Gravelines that followed was fierce. Broadsides roared, masts splintered, and the channel churned with smoke and flame. By the end, the Armada was broken, its formation shattered. But it was not English guns alone that sealed Spain's fate. Nature itself rose against the invaders. As the Armada fled north around Scotland and Ireland, storms tore through its battered fleet. Ships wrecked on jagged coasts, men starved, drowned, or froze. Of the 130 ships that had left Spain, barely half limped home. Triumph and transformation. The defeat of the Armada was more than a military victory. It was a defining moment of Elizabeth's reign. England, once a vulnerable island, had stood against the greatest power of its age and prevailed. The triumph electrified the nation, woven into legend as proof of divine favor. To Protestants, it was God's judgment on Catholic tyranny. To Elizabeth, it was vindication of her cautious policies and unyielding resolve. The victory gave England a new confidence, a sense of destiny. It did not make England the equal of Spain overnight. Philip's empire remained vast, but it proved that the island kingdom could defy giants. It marked the beginning of England's emergence as a naval power, a path that would, in time, lead to empire. The Queen at her height. Politically, Elizabeth reached the pinnacle of her authority. Her image as the Virgin Queen, defender of the realm, was celebrated in poetry, painting, and pageantry. She became Gloriana, the eternal sovereign, her reign cast as a golden age. Yet even in triumph, she remained wary. She knew the Armada's defeat was not the end of Spain's hostility, and she continued her careful balancing act, wary of overreach. Still, the Armada's failure was the high water mark of her reign. The plots and dangers of earlier years now crystallized into legend. The queen who defied the Pope, outwitted assassins, and stood against the most powerful king in Europe. From the smoke of battle rose not only a legend, but a new horizon, for the strength that had saved England from conquest now drove it to seek glory across the seas. Economy and trade. The thunder of cannon at Gravelines had scarcely faded before England turned its gaze outward. Victory over the Armada had given Elizabeth's realm more than security. It had given it confidence. A kingdom that once clung to survival on the margins of Europe now felt the stirrings of destiny. Commerce and exploration became the lifeblood of the Elizabethan age, a new frontier where ambition could be measured not in acres of land but in oceans crossed and fortunes won. The rise of a merchant kingdom. England in the late 16th century was not yet rich compared to Spain or Venice, but it was restless. Trade had long been the province of wool, the fleeces of English sheep fueling looms in Flanders. Under Elizabeth, this trade expanded, but it also began to diversify. Merchants looked beyond the Channel to markets farther afield. Cloth was exported not only to Europe, but to the Levant, Russia, and the Mediterranean. The Muscovy Company sent ships through icy seas to barter with czars. The Levant Company carried English goods to Ottoman ports, bringing back silks and spices that dazzled London's markets. The city of London grew into a financial hub. Its guild halls bustled, its docks thrummed with the cries of sailors and traders. The merchant adventurer replaced the feudal knight as the symbol of wealth and daring. A new class of gentry, enriched by the dissolution of monasteries and invested in overseas trade, gave England both capital and appetite for risk. The lure of the New World. Beyond Europe, the New World beckoned. Spain and Portugal had carved vast empires, their galleons heavy with silver and gold. For England, still a minor player, the riches of America shimmered like a mirage. Privateers such as Francis Drake and John Hawkins tested the limits of piracy and patriotism, plundering Spanish fleets and returning with treasures that filled the royal coffers. Walter Raleigh dreamed of colonies across the Atlantic. His voyages to Virginia, though fragile and short-lived, marked the first stirrings of an English empire in the Americas. Tobacco, potatoes, and tales of golden cities entered the imagination of the English people. Though success was halting, the ambition was unmistakable. The seas, once barriers, had become highways of opportunity. The East India Company. The greatest symbol of this expanding ambition came in 1600, when Elizabeth granted a charter to the East India Company. A handful of merchants, bound together in pursuit of trade with Asia, were given monopoly rights to the treasures of the East. Spices, silks, and exotic goods lay at the far end of this dream, and though its first voyages were tentative, the charter marked a turning point. From this seed would grow a corporation that would one day wield the power of armies and empires. In that moment, however, the company was one more expression of Elizabethan daring. Private wealth fused with national aspiration, the spirit of adventure institutionalized into commerce. The common people. For ordinary Englishmen, the changes were double-edged. Prosperity came unevenly. Merchants grew rich, ports thrived, and London swelled into a metropolis of 200,000 souls, its streets crowded with apprentices, traders, and beggars alike. But enclosure of land continued, driving peasants from fields to cities. Inflation gnawed at wages, and poverty was widespread. Elizabeth's government responded with the Poor Laws, attempting to distinguish between the deserving poor, who could not work, and the undeserving, who would be punished for idleness. It was a sign of the times. The old safety nets of monasteries were gone, replaced by state measures that sought to manage poverty rather than eradicate it. A kingdom on the move. Yet despite hardship, the pulse of commerce beat strong. English ships ranged farther than ever before. Exotic goods, new crops, and tales of foreign lands entered the bloodstream of the nation. Elizabeth herself, cautious with money, nonetheless recognized the value of trade as the engine of power. She lent her prestige to explorers, licensed merchants, and used commerce as a tool of diplomacy. By the end of her reign, England had not yet achieved the wealth of Spain or the dominance of the Dutch, but the trajectory was clear. From the wool of its sheep to the spices of the Indies, from the harbors of London to the shores of Virginia, England was no longer an island clinging to survival. It was a kingdom in motion, its sails billowing with ambition, its merchants writing the first lines of a global story. The Elizabethan economy was not a golden flood, but a rising tide, sometimes cruel, sometimes bountiful, but always restless. It was the foundation upon which empire would one day be built, the hum of trade beneath the music of poets and the thunder of cannon. In the bustling markets and creaking ships of Elizabeth's reign lay the beginnings of England's transformation, from kingdom to power, from survivor to contender on the world stage. As wealth trickled through ports and markets, so too did imagination flow through halls and playhouses, for prosperity did not only enrich the purse, it awakened the spirit. Culture and the English Renaissance. While ships carried England's merchants across oceans and gold trickled into London's coffers, another transformation unfolded, one not of trade or war, but of spirit. The Elizabethan age became a theater of words, music, and spectacle, a flowering of culture that would etch itself into the soul of the nation. The same kingdom that once trembled under the fires of heresy now blazed with the light of creativity. The age of the word. At the heart of this cultural rebirth stood the English language itself. No longer confined to chronicles and sermons, it burst into poetry and drama with a vigor unmatched in Europe. Writers seized the rhythms of the common tongue, blending courtly elegance with the pulse of the street. William Shakespeare emerged as the towering figure of this Renaissance. His plays, comedies alive with wit, tragedies heavy with fate, histories woven with politics, captured the vast spectrum of human nature. On the stage of the Globe Theatre, under the open sky, kings and fools, lovers and villains came alive before audiences of all classes. His words, rich and pliant, shaped not only theater but the very consciousness of a nation discovering itself. But Shakespeare was not alone. Christopher Marlowe's verse crackled with ambition and danger, his heroes reaching for forbidden power. Edmund Spenser, with The Faerie Queen, spun allegories that celebrated Elizabeth herself as Gloriana, the virgin queen of myth and majesty. Together they forged a literature that rivaled the splendors of Renaissance Italy, but in a distinctly English voice. Music and pageantry. The court itself was a stage, and Elizabeth its central actress. Masks, tournaments, and progresses through the countryside turned monarchy into theater. The Queen, adorned in silks and jewels, became both ruler and symbol. Composers such as William Byrd and Thomas Tallis gave sound to the age, their polyphonic masses and madrigals blending devotion with artistry. Even as religion fractured, music unified, echoing through cathedrals and chambers alike. Elizabeth understood the power of spectacle. Her portraits, carefully crafted, presented her as eternal youth, cloaked in symbols of purity and empire. She became not only a queen, but an icon, a living myth whose image bound her people together. The People's Renaissance. This was not only an age of courtiers and poets, but of people. The theaters, often dismissed as rowdy and dangerous, became crucibles of imagination. In their wooden galleries, merchants, apprentices, nobles, and beggars stood shoulder to shoulder, laughing, weeping, and marveling together. The stories of kings and lovers spoke not only to the elite but to the nation as a whole. Printing presses spread ballads and pamphlets, carrying ideas beyond London into villages and taverns. Knowledge, once the preserve of monasteries, now flowed into the hands of commoners. The hunger for words, for song, for story, was insatiable. A golden image. By the twilight of Elizabeth's reign, England saw itself reflected in this cultural mirror. It was a nation scarred by war, poverty, and religious division, yet in its words and music, it found glory. The Elizabethan Renaissance was not simply imitation of Europe's classical rebirth, it was England declaring itself alive, vibrant, and destined for greatness. When foreign ambassadors visited the court, they found not only a queen, but a kingdom radiant with art and intellect. When commoners crowded the theaters, they participated in the shaping of a culture that would outlast empires. It was here, in the marriage of crown and culture, that the legend of Elizabeth's golden age was forged. The age of Shakespeare and Spenser, of Tallis and Bird, of courtly spectacle and popular theater, became inseparable from the age of Elizabeth herself. And so, while her ships ventured into uncharted seas and her soldiers faced down the might of Spain, it was in words and song that Elizabeth's reign achieved immortality. But even as her reign shone in poetry and pageantry, the passage of time could not be stilled. Beneath the brilliance, the twilight of Elizabeth's rule quietly approached. The final years of Elizabeth's reign. By the 1590s, Elizabeth Tudor was no longer the radiant young queen crowned amid pageantry and promise. She had ruled for more than 3 decades, and though her image in portraits remained untouched, her face smoothed, her body cloaked in eternal youth, time had marked her. Her fiery red hair gave way to wigs, her teeth blackened, her frame grew thin. Yet her will remained unbroken, her crown still steady upon her head. The golden age endured, but its light grew flickering, tempered by shadows of war, rebellion, and personal loss. Shadows of war. The triumph over the Spanish Armada had not ended conflict with Spain. War dragged on across the 1590s, draining treasure and blood. English ships still harried Spanish fleets, but victories were costly and uncertain. In Ireland, rebellion erupted under Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, who rose with Spanish support. The 9 Years' War consumed the Queen's resources. Her armies bogged down in bitter fighting across Irish bog and forest. Elizabeth, once triumphant, now faced the burden of sustaining empire without the wealth of Spain or the stability of peace. The crown's coffers thinned, taxes weighed upon her subjects, and murmurs of discontent echoed even amid glory the court of the aging queen. Within her court, Elizabeth grew more suspicious, her once playful charm edged by temper and fear. Trusted advisers who had guided her since youth, William Cecil, Lord Burghley, and Francis Walsingham, passed into death. Their places were filled by a younger generation, ambitious but fractious. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, rose as her favorite, dashing and impetuous, but his pride proved his undoing. In 1601, Essex led a reckless rebellion, marching into London with a handful of followers in a desperate bid for power. The rising collapsed within hours. Essex was captured, tried, and executed. For Elizabeth, it was a personal wound. The young man she had once doted on, now another name among the traitors condemned by the weight of her crown. The Queen alone loss surrounded her. Courtiers whispered of her melancholy, of nights spent standing silent, her finger pressed to her lips, lost in thought. The music and pageantry of her earlier years gave way to silence. She lingered in her chambers, reluctant to rest, unwilling to eat, her body failing as her spirit resisted. And yet, even in decline, she remained formidable. Ambassadors still trembled before her gaze, nobles still bent the knee, and her people still revered her as the Virgin Queen. Her authority, though waning, was unshaken. She had ruled as no woman before her, turning her gender into strength, her solitude into legend. The end of an era. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace. She was 70 years old. Her body, dressed in royal robes, was borne to Westminster Abbey, where thousands lined the streets in mourning. Bells tolled, black banners fluttered, and the people wept. For with her death ended not only a reign, but an era. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the two kingdoms under one monarch. The Tudor line, begun in blood at Bosworth with Henry VII, ended in the quiet chamber of a queen without children. The legacy of Elizabeth's final years were marked by shadows, yet her legacy was undeniable. She had ruled longer than any Tudor, steering her kingdom through peril into triumph. She had defeated Spain, nurtured trade, presided over a cultural renaissance, and bound her image to the identity of her people. Her reign was remembered as a golden age, not because it was free of hardship, but because she turned hardship into endurance, survival into splendor. She left behind no heir, but she left behind a nation transformed, confident, resilient, and ready to stride into a new century. Elizabeth died as she had lived, alone, enigmatic, and sovereign. And though her body was laid to rest, her age lived on, forever remembered as the Age of Gloriana. And with her death, not only did a queen pass into history, but an entire dynasty came to its end. The Tudor story, begun in blood at Bosworth, now closed in the silence of Elizabeth's tomb. The legacy of the Tudors. When Elizabeth Tudor breathed her last in the spring of 1603, it was not only the end of a reign, it was the closing of a dynasty that had shaped England with fire and iron for more than a century. From the battlefield at Bosworth, where Henry VII seized his fragile crown, to the glittering court of Elizabeth I, the Tudors had steered their realm through civil war, religious upheaval, and international rivalry. Their line was short, only 5 monarchs and a single century, yet their impact was so vast that it would echo through the centuries to come. A dynasty born in blood. The Tudors began in crisis. Henry VII's victory ended the Wars of the Roses, yet his dynasty was never free of suspicion. It was forged in calculation, maintained through careful marriages, and defended with ruthless vigilance. His reign established peace where none had existed, but it was a peace watched over by spies and sharpened by fear. And yet from that uneasy foundation, stability grew. Henry VII filled the treasury, strengthened the crown, and prepared the stage for his larger-than-life son. In him, the dynasty's true drama began. The revolution of Henry VIII. Henry VIII embodied both the glory and the peril of Tudor rule. Handsome, athletic, and brilliant in youth, he seemed destined to be the perfect Renaissance prince. Instead, his reign tore the kingdom from Rome, shattered the unity of Christendom in England, and remade the very fabric of society. The break with the Catholic Church was more than a marital dispute. It was a revolution. Monasteries fell, their stones scattered, their wealth seized. The Church of England rose in their place, forever altering the relationship between monarch and subject. Henry's 6 marriages, his tyranny, his excesses, might have doomed his dynasty, but instead, they made it unforgettable. Edward, Mary, and the test of faith. Henry's heirs carried the burden of his legacy. Edward VI, young and devoutly Protestant, pushed reform forward, his court ablaze with radical zeal. But his early death left the throne to Mary I, who sought to reverse the tide. Mary's reign was short and scarred by flames. Her attempt to restore Catholicism through persecution earned her the bitter epithet, Bloody Mary. Yet her tragedy was deeper still. She failed to secure an heir, and her dream of a Catholic England withered with her. Elizabeth and the Golden Age. It was Elizabeth who gave the Tudors their final defining chapter. For 45 years she ruled with cunning, patience, and flair, turning her gender into a weapon and her solitude into myth. She faced plots, rebellions, and the might of Spain, yet emerged triumphant. Her reign was not without shadows. Poverty stalked her people, war drained her treasury, and her refusal to marry left her throne uncertain. Yet the image she crafted, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the radiant heart of a golden age, was so powerful it became truth in the minds of her people. Under her, England found a new confidence. Trade expanded, exploration reached across oceans, and culture flowered into an English renaissance of words and music. She left no heir, but she left a kingdom ready to face the future. The Tudor imprint. The Tudors changed England forever. They centralized power, strengthened the monarchy, and bound the crown to Parliament in uneasy but lasting partnership. They broke from Rome, laying the foundations of a national church and shaping the religious divisions that would endure for generations. They encouraged trade and exploration, opening the first channels of what would become an empire. But perhaps their greatest legacy was psychological. They gave the English people a story, a sense of destiny born from struggle, survival, and triumph. From Bosworth to the Armada, from Henry's defiance of Rome to Elizabeth's dazzling court, the Tudors created not only rulers but legends. The end of a dynasty, the birth of an era. When James VI of Scotland inherited the English crown as James I, the Tudor bloodline ended. Yet the dynasty's work endured. The Stuarts inherited a kingdom more unified, more confident, and more ambitious than the fractured realm Henry VII had won. The age of the Tudors had been one of turbulence, but also of transformation. Their legacy was not peace, it was motion. They propelled England from medieval monarchy into early modern power, from feudal struggle into the first stirrings of empire. They left behind no heirs, but they left behind a nation remade. The Tudors had ruled as conquerors, reformers, tyrants, and icons. Their century was short, but their shadow was long. And as the coffin of Elizabeth I sank into the earth at Westminster Abbey, the bells that tolled for the last Tudor also rang in a new England, an England forever shaped by the dynasty that rose from blood to glory.